Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. China, it ain't Kansas. You might see panda bears named Win-Win at a Chinese zoo, but you won't see a trace of the win-win mindset in any Chinese negotiating forum. If you want to stay above ground and out of jail or quarantine in today's lockup nation, you really should listen to this podcast. Dan Harris provides excellent insights into many facets of conducting business in today's transforming China. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Thank you for joining Solution Nation. Today's program is focusing on doing business in China and enforcing contracts in China. Speaking on this issue, very pleased to welcome Dan Harris. Dan Harris is the founder of Harris Bricken, which is an international law firm with lawyers in Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, New York City, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Mexico City, Barcelona, and Beijing. Dan Harris is internationally regarded as a leading authority on legal matters related to doing business in emerging markets. Forbes, Businessweek, Fortune, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, The Economist, and CNBC, the New York Times, and many other major media players have looked to Dan for his perspective on international law issues. So Dan, it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So let's just dive right into the topic. Maybe tell us about the business climate for Westerners that want to transact business in China.
Okay, that's actually a surprisingly tough question because it changes every day. And by changes, I don't mean things are vacillating up and down. I mean, pretty much every day something happens that makes it worse. And it's hard almost to keep up. You've got the COVID, you've got what China's doing with COVID, what cities in lockdown next, what cities in lockdown now. You've got the bad relations between the United States and China. You've got the sanctions that are happening somewhat piecemeal. What is President Biden going to prohibit Americans from selling to China? What will China do in retaliation? Today's big issue is what's going on with the EU. The EU is talking about how they're going to respond to what came out, I believe it was yesterday, the UN report basically saying that what China is doing in Xinjiang constitutes crimes against humanity. I mean, it is almost every single day that something comes down that makes things worse between China and the rest of the world. And I just went through all those things, and I didn't even mention Taiwan because I forgot about it. It's one of many.
Yeah. Well, first of all, can Westerners even get into China? Are we allowed to go into China? And if so, what price do we pay in terms of getting their vaccinations and quarantines?
I don't even know. And I say that because that's something that's very difficult to keep up on. And for most of our clients, it's become surprisingly unimportant because whether you can get in or not is almost not the issue, because for quite some time you have been able to get in. It's just whether it's worth it, meaning how long are you going to be quarantined? Is it worth going to make a 3-day visit to your factory if you're going to have to spend 30 days in a hotel before you can do it, or get tested every 12 or 24 hours? No. So that's not, I mean, interestingly enough, that's not a question we're getting. No one's going there. Whether you can or not, nobody is. I see stories where somebody will on LinkedIn. I know somebody in Shanghai who wrote about how he was finally out of quarantine. And I thought to myself, why the heck did you even go? And then I realized that his entire family was there. So that's the situation now. That's bad and not likely to change. I'm extremely pessimistic about China changing its COVID policy. Many people, I'm going to go into this because this sort of is a microcosm of what's really going on in China these days. You get these people, well, back in December, I wrote a blog post saying, China and Omicron, you better buckle up. And I said, things are only going to get worse. And I listed out various reasons why. And all these people wrote me, complained, said, oh, that's ridiculous. You're ignoring the fact that China's going to do a great job keeping COVID down. They're going to get more people vaccinated, this, that, and the other thing. And my response was, you're ignoring the fact that China actually likes these lockdowns. It's not a coincidence that the first big lockdown, which was unbelievably excessive, was again Shanghai. I mean, Shanghai is the international city. It's the liberal city. It was President Xi flexing his control muscle. And I mean, it's fascinating to me that China could make its people take a vaccine, even if it's the crappy, borderline worthless Chinese vaccine, but it chooses not to do so. It chooses to do these lockdowns and keep people in fear of lockdowns. And that's the perfect excuse to control everybody, to put in more cameras, to know where everybody's going at every second. It's 1984 times 10. I guess that would be what? 1,984.
Okay. So I'll just say a few things, then you can tell me if you agree or disagree, have different ideas. So there may be a connection between all the lockdowns and a potential invasion of Taiwan. I have heard some people say that the lockdowns are stress testing the different cities and the different industries in response to sanctions that will come about if China invades Taiwan. So they're preparing for the consequences of the invasion. And I believe a week or so ago, Premier Xi mandated that all the senior people in the government sell their foreign holdings, so they won't be sanctioned. They won't be vulnerable to sanctions after an invasion of Taiwan. So there's that issue. I understand that if Westerners go to China, they have to be vaccinated by the lousy vaccines they have in China, even if you're fully boosted in the U.S. And then the last thing I'll say is, if I were to go to China and the Chinese government detected that I said something negative about China, instead of making it a political issue, saying they're arresting me because of political disharmony that I'm sowing in their society, they could say I have COVID. And for my own protection, they're putting me in quarantine, wherever that may be.
I assume all of those things are true or might be true. I've heard all those things. I believe all of those things are more probably than not accurate. The bit about a stress test for Taiwan, that could be true. I believe it's a stress test for something. And one thing, and I hate to say this, but I feel like I have to say it, because I've become so negative on China. There are two things I want to make clear. Number one, I haven't always been negative on China. I was actually pro-China until probably 2015. When people would complain about China, I would say, it's a developing country. They're working on it. Give them time. So long as the trend, even if it was a very slight trend, so long as the trend was upwards with a developing country, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I gave China the benefit of the doubt for a long time. So that's number one. And number two, I feel that I always have to say that I am not a conspiracy theorist. I'm what I call, I'm not a Trump supporter, never have been. I just, and I don't think of myself as a conservative. I just think that China is a bad apple, and it's got nothing to do with politics. And I've been dealing, it has to do with reality. I've been dealing with China for a long time. And in the last 5 years, my mantra has always been that if you want to figure out what China is going to do or how it's going to act, and by China, I mean the CCP, you should assume the absolute worst and then try to assume something even worse than that, and you'll be right. And if you do that, it becomes very easy to predict what China is going to do. That's how in December I was able to predict these lockdowns, because that's where I could see them going. China, people laugh, but for years I've been saying, I mean, in let's say 2005, everybody was talking about how China was the next, big powerhouse, economic powerhouse. Everything was going to be great. I never really bought into that, because you never know on something like that. But over, let's say, the last 5 years, I've been telling people, if you want to see where China's going, look at North Korea. And people used to laugh at that, and they don't anymore. And so you talk about all these strictures that are being placed on foreigners, like having to get the Chinese vaccine. Well, China doesn't like foreigners. North Korea doesn't like foreigners. Those people interfere with control. And China is becoming increasingly totalitarian, or I should say authoritarian. I don't know. They're becoming increasingly authoritarian.
Yeah, it's a shame. I was going to China at least once a year for 5 years, running my courses on patent valuation and negotiations, and I liked it. It was a foreign experience. I didn't really fit in. I don't speak Chinese, and it wasn't like any other city where you could go to a restaurant and talk to people. But I still liked it. It was still fun, and I felt free. I didn't feel threatened. But now it's too dangerous to go.
Right. And here's something else, though. What's so interesting is there are the people on social media who are essentially paid oftentimes by the Chinese government. And if you say, China or something generally or something like that, then you'll be criticized for acting like all Chinese think alike, which is, of course, absurd. But on the flip side, the CCP encourages that belief, meaning they want the world to think that the CCP has 99.9% support. But that is not true, and that is not possible. It's impossible to know how many people truly support the current regime, but there were a lot of people who opposed Xi coming into office when he came into office, and those people haven't all died or disappeared. There are a lot of people in China who do not like the way things are going. It's hard to put a number on it, but I'm guessing it's, anywhere from 40 to 55%. So when we look at it, it has not become North Korea. Look at Hong Kong. Do you think that all of a sudden Hong Kong went from not wanting China in there to loving them? I don't think so. They've gone from not wanting China there to keeping their mouths shut because they have to.
Right. Okay. So maybe we can talk about what it's like to conduct business in China. So most Americans or Westerners are not going to China these days. Do the Chinese feel they have more leverage in contracts with their American or Western counterparts, and they're taking advantage of that?
That's a great question. I would say sort of. It's really interesting because if you have a good contract with your Chinese counterpart and it doesn't involve something of crucial significance to the Chinese government, meaning if I have a contract with a Chinese manufacturer to make rubber duckies for me and they violate that contract, I can sue and I will win. If I have a contract for cutting edge semiconductors and my Chinese counterpart violates that contract, then good luck, because the Chinese government really cares about that. So shockingly enough, I haven't seen any change in that over the years. Where I have seen a change is not so much Chinese companies taking advantage of the Chinese government's position on things, because the typical Chinese company, privately held company anyway, they're capitalists. They're out to make money. They're not terribly political. So they don't necessarily care. But the change that I have seen is there's this view, and it isn't really a contractual change so much, but there's a view now in China that, I should say a much greater view, because there's always been a little bit of this view, that things could change tomorrow. And so what we're seeing a lot of is a company will, let's say, had just happened recently to a Spanish company that came to us. They went over to China. They met with the Chinese company. They showed them some of what they were doing. And by the time they got back to Spain, they realized that this Chinese company had ghosted them and was going off and making their products with the information that they had gathered. That is becoming increasingly common because the Chinese company is saying, well, I'm not going to have a 10-year relationship with them because of all that's going on. So I might as well grab what I can right now. So if you don't have a contract, if you don't protect yourself before you go, your risks are a lot higher. As of now, the contracts still work, and it's not like you have any choice, meaning people say, well, how good is the Chinese contract? And my first answer is, it's better than no contract. That I can guarantee you.
And do you recommend that the contracts be written in English and Chinese, or just one or the other? And then what provisions would you put in contracts for reconciling disputes?
Okay. Most, and this shocks a lot of people and it even disappoints people, but most of the time we advocate for putting the contracts in Chinese as the one official language and having disputes resolved in China. The reason we do that is because China does not enforce most foreign court judgments, and it is not all that good at enforcing foreign arbitrations either. So people say, well, I want to have my lawsuit in Boston because I know I can win. And I'll say, yes, you'll win in Boston, but winning a lawsuit is not the goal. The goal is collecting on the lawsuit. But the other key is, and that's sort of an American Western way of thinking of contracts. In emerging market countries, you need to focus on more than the ability to enforce a contract. I always say there are three benefits to having a contract. One is being able to enforce it by suing in Chicago or wherever. The other is fear. As long as your counterpart thinks your contract will be effective, then it can be valuable, because a legitimate Chinese company is not going to want to get sued. So notice how I say legitimate. It's important you know who you're doing business with. We can write the world's best contract. If you're dealing with a crook or a non-existent company, the contract's not worth anything. So you want to create fear, and there are a lot of different ways to do that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But the other thing you want is the third thing you want is clarity, and putting it in Chinese really helps that. And the reason we want only one official language is, I always joke that when people say, but I want English and Chinese to be the official languages, I always say, I do too, so that if there's ever a dispute, I can charge you 3 times as much, because we're essentially litigating 3 disputes. What does the Chinese version say? What does the US version say? And what do they mean together? And it really, it virtually never makes sense to have more than one official language. Now, I said we do these in Chinese, et cetera. If the Chinese company has assets in the United States or in Israel or in Europe, and you can do the contract with the entity that actually owns those assets, then it's a different matter. Or even so, it's not always this way, but it is most of the time.
So how do you know when you have a contract in China? How do you know that it's binding? Are there special stamps that you need to put on the contracts, notaries, recordation of the contract? And how elastic is the Chinese language? You know, sometimes in languages, one word can mean different things and its interpretation.
Okay, I'm going to start with the last part first. Drafting a good and clear Chinese contracts is, in many respects, easier than drafting a good and clear English language contract. And that's because the Chinese system, and I won't bore people with too much detail here, but the US, Canadian, British system is a common law system. That means that it's based mostly on court decisions. China is a civil law system, which means it's based mostly on statute. So a 20-page US contract, if we were to take that and make it a quote unquote China contract, it would probably be 8 or 9 pages. Because a lot of what's in the American or the British contract is total fluff and just confusing in a Chinese contract. You know, all those provisions, its successors, assignees, et cetera. No, in a Chinese contract, there might be 1 word or 2 words that make that clear. And that's how it's written in the statute, and that's how you pull it. So drafting a good Chinese language contract requires that you know the statute. It requires that you understand that it is a different country. And so things like, when we do distribution agreements in China, they tend to actually be very similar to distribution agreements anywhere else, except China has more freedom of contract. So the distributor's not as protected. And then one other example is, in fact, I just got this from a British client of ours. They've got this, 25-page manufacturing agreement that they want to use for China, and it has in there injunctive relief. Well, getting injunctive relief that's a good way to protect your IP in some countries, but getting injunctive relief in China is difficult. In China, what you want is a liquidated damages provision saying, hey, if you steal my IP, you owe me $1 million. And the Chinese courts tend to enforce that. I all of a sudden I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. So the part about determining when you actually have a binding contract, what kind of official documentation do you need? Do you need stamps, recordation in certain government offices, notaries, and so forth?
Okay, great question. So for instance, a lot of IP contracts like licensing agreements or trademark assignments are supposed to be recorded with specific government offices. I have been told that not recording them does not necessarily affect their validity or impact your ability to enforce them. But I've never tested that out because it's too big a risk, so we record them. If we ever had a client who insisted that it be kept confidential, then we would dig in and research the heck out of that issue. In terms of stamps and things like that, the technical rule is that a contract that is signed is a legitimate contract. But the reason you want the stamp is because the stamp means that the person that it's been authorized by the company. So you don't want a situation, and I know this is going to sound laughable, but this is not uncommon, where the Chinese company's defense is, hey, that person, I know she's the CEO of the company, but she wasn't authorized to sign this kind of contract. They don't really deal much in apparent authority. And so I always tell our clients, look, would we win that argument? Yeah, I think we would. Do you want to spend $25,000 trying to win that argument? No, you get the stamp, you get it now. That makes it clear they won't make that argument. We won't have to fight it. So that's what you do. Now, even in talking about this, what's really interesting is how successful we have been, and the other lawyers who I know do things right outside of our law firm, at avoiding litigation in China. And that's because if you draft a contract that the Chinese side knows is going to work, then they're generally not going to breach it, and you don't have to deal with these issues.
Okay. To what extent is China a centralized federal system versus the differences between the different provinces? Do you need to worry about local provincial law, or just focus on the central government?
Boy, that you've been asking me a lot of tough questions. That's the toughest one of all. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have clients who would go into some town and not have to pay taxes for 5 years and build a hotel on property that's zoned for nothing but military uses. And all of that seemed to work because the local governments were powerful. Beijing has been cracking down on that sort of thing for a long, long time. And generally, as lawyers, if it's not real estate, it's pretty much not local anymore. We do what we tell our clients, you do what Beijing tells you to do, otherwise you're at big risk. And to tell you the difference in the change, we had a client 8-10 years ago who we said their general manager in, I think it was Qingdao, can't remember where, their general manager wanted to do things the local way. We said this, we think this is a mistake. We told our client, look, right now we're doing it half and half. We're doing some things the right way. We're doing some things the Guanxi local way. That's worse. That's the worst way of all, because we're now on everybody's map. So we basically said, look, you need to decide between us and your general manager. And he said, I've got to choose. Nothing against you. I've got to choose my general manager because I don't really have any choice. And we're like, yeah, we get it. So we're just going to resign. We wish you the best of luck. And he called us 6 minutes later and said Beijing had shut them down. So, you can try to do things locally. I wouldn't. And in terms of the laws that we deal with, the IP laws, the contract laws, that's all national. The only place where local comes into play is, I mentioned you have rubber duckies on one side of the spectrum where you'll get a fair trial, and cutting edge semiconductors on the other side of the spectrum where you probably won't. If you're doing business with the biggest company in a small town, then you're sort of on the semiconductor side because you're going to be in front of a court in that small town probably. But eventually you might get to the Court of Appeals farther away, et cetera. But you're still at greater risk in that situation. So local can still influence things. Then again, I'd rather see my client be, if my client's from New York, I'd rather see them in litigation in Seattle than in rural Mississippi. So it's not so different from that.
Okay. So if a dispute does arise, maybe we can talk a little bit about initiating the proceedings, initiating litigation if it comes to that. I've heard that there's some games that are played as far as making it difficult to serve notice to a company that they're a target of litigation, that one company was a very, very large company, but there's only one individual that could receive the notice, and he was never available, on sabbatical or whatever. Are there other games played as far as ownership of the company? You think you know who the real owner is, but there's a different company that owns it, and that's the one that has to be served. And then in patent damages, for instance, when things were better 5 years ago, 7 years ago, when things were better, Westerners had more of a chance of winning a patent infringement case, but the damages awards were very, very low. You could win, but there'd be very little money. And one of the reasons I believe was because you have to make a deposit. If you're asserting your patents against the Chinese company, you have to make a deposit to start that litigation, and nobody wants to make a very large deposit because they're not sure if they're going to win. So anyway, those are a couple of ideas you can chat about.
Yeah. I'm of the view that in pretty much every country, if you have to sue, you've already lost. So it should be avoided at all costs. China's no different, but it, as a place to litigate, it has its pros and cons. I did a lot of work many years ago for a Polish multi-millionaire international entrepreneur. He and I were very good friends. He would always complain about how long things were taking in the United States. And then when we would win, he'd be happy. So then he had some big case in Poland that I helped out on because there were US issues, and things moved really quickly. And the judge didn't really seem to know what was going on terribly well. So there are always pros and cons, yin and yang. And in China, cases move very quickly. There's no real discovery. So you better know your case inside and out before you file. There are plenty of good litigators in China. They'll oftentimes take on a case. I don't quite know how they do it, but they might take on a big case and say, okay, it's a $70,000 flat fee. Whereas in the United States, you'd tell the client, well, if we settle early, it'll be $30,000. If we don't, it could be $500,000. So there are some good aspects to Chinese litigation. Damages are oftentimes complained about in China. And I don't necessarily see it as a good or bad thing. it's something that's inherent with China right now, which is they're not being unfair or even anti-foreign in their damages calculations usually. It's just that they don't really buy into this idea of massive damages. So, for instance, I'll often say to the clients, look, you're not happy with our saying that the liquidated damages should be $500,000 here, but we don't want to go too high or the court won't even grant you that. And our goal with this is not so much to get you $500,000, it's to prevent your IP from being stolen. And let me tell you something, they're not going to award you $25 million for the theft of IP on a product that hasn't come out yet. They don't really deal in lost profits. It's just not really part of their system yet. I mean, now I say this and somebody could call in and say, well, I had a case where I got some lost profits. Well, yeah, but it's really not the way it is in the West yet. It just isn't. So yes, that's a factor. The other thing that people need to understand about Chinese litigation is that a lot of times foreigners will say to me, oh, I lost this case, I should have won it, and then they'll tell me about the case, and I'll be thinking to myself, well, we would never have brought that case. Yes, you would have won it in the United States, but there you won't because, and it's not necessarily because of unfairness, it's because of equity, which is a concept around the world, but they take it very seriously in China. People laugh when they talk about having a harmonious society, but harmony is a factor in lawsuits. So many years ago, we had a client who was out a lot of money because they called somebody in China, the freight company or something, and said, has the product arrived? And that person said, yes, it has. Well, it hadn't. Our client paid the money. And then actually our client ended up getting sued by a client in England because they never provided the goods to the company in England. And then we ended up representing the client in England in China against the company that had said the freight had arrived. And we wanted to settle the case. We told our client they needed to settle because we were terrified that the court would not penalize the company for the acts of a low-level employee who had been probably paid off, let's say $2,000 to lie. In the United States, the company would be on the hook. In China, it wouldn't be. And we were terrified. And it had nothing to do with being a foreign company because the company that we were talking about suing was actually from India. So you've got to think about things like that. It is a different system, not necessarily better or worse, but just very different.
So you mentioned a very powerful phrase, harmonious society. My understanding in China is they have very broad brushed rules and laws that say that it's a crime to disrupt the harmonious society, something like that. And there's consequences to that. Can a business dispute that a Westerner brings be characterized to be inharmonious, not conducive to their harmonious society? And can that lead to criminal charges?
Yes, except take harmonious out of what you said, and then I'll say yes. I've not heard of a situation where the crime was a violation against a harmonious society. But there are things, I used to have a list of these, but I'm not sure I can even think of one, where it can rise to the level of a criminal violation in China in a business context that Westerners would not even contemplate being a criminal violation. I would not say, shockingly enough, I would not say that any of those are absurd laws in China. The ones that we used to talk about this more, but with so many fewer people in China now, it's become less important. But yes, and I don't attribute that necessarily to authoritarianism. I just attribute it to a different system more than anything else. So yes, a misrepresentation, for instance, can more likely be criminal in China than in the United States or Israel or the UK or something like that. But I've got to tell you, there are times in the United States where I'm appalled at what people can get away with that ought to sometimes rise to the level of being criminal and don't. Where, somebody does a deal, they don't really have the money, they sort of misrepresent their company, et cetera. And then the other side's out a lot of money and there's nothing criminal about it. And I mean, we had a client once and one of their employees left with a computer that had, $50 million worth of information on it. And we called the police and said, go arrest this person. And the police said, that's a civil matter. I'm like, it's not. This person stole a computer. Well, it's an ex-employee. It's a civil matter. It's not a civil matter. So there's, I just call it cultural difference more than anything.
Okay. My understanding is in the legal system in China, there's no notion of perjury or contempt of court, or they don't put weight on precedent. Is that true or not true?
It's mostly true, meaning that the courts and the arbitrators generally assume that everybody's lying. And therefore, the documents become everything. And so going back to contracts, if you and I right now said, hey, if I said, I love your globe, will you sell it to me for $500? And you said yes. And then I sent you an email saying, this is to confirm I'm going to buy your globe for $500. And then it turns out, well, actually, I'm mixing two things here, but it turns out you don't send me the globe, or the back half of the globe is completely in really bad quality. So now there are two differences between the West and China that I'm going to illustrate. In China, I could make an argument, and it would be a pretty good argument, that we had a contract. But the court might not really want to hear it. They want to see a contract with a stamp, with a signature. So when people come to us and say, I've got this Chinese company, they gave me $5 million worth of terrible product, I want to sue them. I'll say, do you have a contract? And they'll go, well, what do you mean by a contract? I mean, like a 10-page agreement setting out the quality, et cetera, et cetera. And they go, no. And I go, well, we would never take that case on a contingency fee. And we'd really have to analyze whether it's worth bringing. I'm not saying you can't win it. I'm saying it's not nearly as good a case as if you had a contract that said exactly what the quality is that's required. I shudder when these companies send me a contract that says of reasonable quality. That has meaning in the United States and in the UK. That has almost no meaning in China. So an example I always give is a company came to us. They had gotten about $3 million worth. They had ordered $3 million worth of North Carolina blue or Israel blue. The colors are pretty similar. T-shirts, and they had gotten a sample back that was North Carolina blue, but when they got the T-shirts, it was blue. And that made them basically unsellable for anything but, pennies on the dollar. And we did not like the case, and we suggested they not bring it. What they needed to do was they should have had a contract that said it's Pantene number such and such, making very clear what the contract is. If they had had that, they probably would have gotten the shirts. And if they hadn't, they would have had a really good lawsuit. So what I always say about Chinese contracts is, if it's not in the contract, it doesn't exist. And that's another big difference between China and the West, where the judges are more likely to say, well, of course, when Dan bought that globe, he assumed that it was in usable condition. And that was legitimate, and that's what the contract said.
Okay. As far as collecting damages, you made a good point. If the company has assets in a different country, that becomes a lot easier, I suppose, to collect those assets. Anything else you want to say about that? I've heard of situations where, a Western litigant wins a case against the Chinese company, and the assets are shifted to another family member. So very hard to collect.
Yes, that happens everywhere in the world. I was just talking with a lawyer saying that I brought one of the first cases to go after a situation like that in Korea. It has to do with the laws in these countries. It has to do with the powers of the courts. The courts in China are not all that powerful in terms of collecting. So what you describe can happen. And that's why a lot of times when we're trying to collect, let's say, 10 million from a Chinese company, we right off the bat tell our clients, look, we've handled a lot of these cases, and I'm not sure we've ever collected the full amount. So I'm telling you that right up front. If we can get 5 million here quickly, that's a victory. And they're disappointed because they want 10 million. But in my view, 5 million is a lot more than zero. So there is a lot of compromising. I've had to deal with this my whole career because it's involved so many different emerging market countries. I had a case once in Russia where our client had a great contract, and it was in Vladivostok, and I was told by our local counsel, who I knew very well and completely trusted, that 9 out of 15 of the judges were corrupt. And we ended up getting a corrupt judge. And Americans would think, well, that's it, we lose. No, because just because the judge is corrupt doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to lose or that we can't settle the case. Because they had a good contract, paying off the judge is going to be really expensive and risky because the contract was so clear, even in a country like Russia. So if we had no contract, they could have paid the judge $15,000 and been done with it. But here it's expensive. And then we could always appeal in a city far away from Vladivostok, maybe go to Moscow. Are they going to pay off the entire Supreme Court? So even in the most corrupt countries, corruption doesn't mean lights out on your lawsuit. And that's the same in a situation like this. It just means you have to handle it differently than you would if you were suing Microsoft in the United States.
Okay. Anything you want to say about the Chinese negotiating practices? Do you think the Chinese have more rounds of negotiations, more rounds of pressuring their counterpart to make concessions? Anything they do to do competitive intelligence before negotiations that maybe we're not familiar with?
More rounds than in the US, yes. More rounds than in some other countries, not necessarily. But what, in terms of competitive intelligence, I tend not to be that impressed with Chinese negotiating tactics. They tend to be incredibly repetitive and oftentimes fairly simplistic. We had a client who wanted to buy a company in China. This was many years ago. The company was probably worth 10 million. We went to the company on behalf of our client and said, "Are you interested in selling?" And the client said 100 million. The Chinese company said 100 million. And we said, 100 million? That's ridiculous. Where'd you even come up with that? And he said, "Well, I've heard that's what American companies pay." Okay, so that's not very sophisticated. A deal never happened. A lot of times, they do things. Their big negotiating tactic is patience, and so what they'll do is they'll push you to give your side, your offer, your proposal first. Then they'll sit on it, and then and they'll push you with like some made up deadline. Hey, we have to do this so that we can meet with the government on January 1st. You get it to them, and then on December 28th, they send you back what you gave them, and what they send back is a complete joke. And a lot of times our clients are like, "Well, I don't think they understood what we sent them." And we have to convince them, no, they completely understood. They're messing with you. What we need to do is tell them, this is unacceptable. We're going to make this one change, and you either take it or we walk away. You just have to be tough with them. It's not really that different from negotiating with anybody else. They just want you to believe that they're Mars and we're Venus, and you don't know what you're doing. And I mean, we did a deal. It was a licensing deal for a good-sized U.S. magazine publisher. The Chinese side would say things like, you need to assign your IP to us, and then we'll give it back to you at the end of the contract. And we'd say, no, we don't want to do that. We want to license it to you. And then they would say, well, the law requires that you assign it to us. And we would say, what law? And they would say, well, there's no point in telling you because you're not Chinese lawyers. And we would say, well, yeah, we're not Chinese lawyers. We can read Chinese, but we also have people who were Chinese lawyers. They're just not licensed anymore because China doesn't allow them to remain licensed. Well, it's not. So each step of the way, we'd have to try to get them to send us the laws. And then finally they said, well, it's not in writing anywhere. Well, there are no laws not in writing. So you just have to push back and not panic. They're doing that less because, this would work when we first started doing China work, we would occasionally get calls from people, legitimate companies that would say, we want to go into China. And I would say, well, what do you want to do? And they would say, well, we're doing this in the US, you tell us. And it's like, well, we're lawyers. We're not going to tell you, because everybody was so desperate to get in because their investors were saying, what's our China plan? And we literally had clients who would say, I don't think this makes sense, but our investors are pushing us. And those companies are now out of China, and they've been out for years. Those days are over. So you're not getting people who are desperate to do China deals anymore. In fact, most of our clients are desperate to get out, but they can't because they can't find manufacturers elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So I'll make one controversial statement. You can completely disassociate yourself with it, and then you can, maybe tell your final comments. So my theory is the population of China is nowhere near 1.5 billion people. It just isn't. One, you can go there and look around and not see very many people. I've been in brand new shopping centers in Shenzhen. I walked about a mile every day on Nanjing Road in Shanghai and ended up seeing the same people. In a lot of cases, there's just not that many people there. I've been in coffee shops for 3 or 4 hours, only see 5 people come in. There's just not. I mean, if you look at the statistics, to have a replacement of population, each woman needs to have 2.1 babies about. In China, they had the one-child policy for so long. After the one-child policy, most couples, don't have more than one child. A lot of them are not marrying. There's a big imbalance between the men and the women. There's no immigration to China. So, if the populations are decreasing in Europe because the replacement cycle is less than 2.1, and the math has to work the same in China. The math can't be different. So anyway, that's my controversial thing. People don't like hearing that because they take a lot of pride in being the biggest country. And I think they just want to be bigger than India. So whatever India's population is, they add 10% to it, similar to whatever the economic growth is in Taiwan. They add 10% to that. So anyway, that's my statement. You don't have to subscribe to it, but if you would like to make any final statements, you can.
I sort of do subscribe to it because that is how they handle their economics. And so there's no reason to think that they wouldn't handle their population the same way. And it's pretty much undisputed that China is sitting on a demographic time bomb. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people think they're trying to speed up things in terms of Taiwan, et cetera. Even with their numbers, their demographics look absolutely terrible. And I do subscribe to the theory that demographics is destiny. That's why I'm such a big believer in Vietnam, where the demographics are incredibly good and the optimism is there, et cetera. It's what I don't know. What you do there is what I do, which is what always surprised me when I was going to China all the time in, let's say, 2008, 2010, is cities like Qingdao seemed to me to be so prosperous. I found it hard to believe that the per capita income was as low as they were saying. And I figured that they were making it lower to make the poor areas higher, because the cities did not seem as low as the numbers, but who knows?
Okay, great. Any final comments you'd like to make?
Well, I've been sitting here thinking throughout this whole episode about the relationship between Israel and China, and it is a fascinating one because Israel is, of course, such a close ally with the United States, and the United States is technologically decoupling from China. And as that happens, China seems to be even more eager to technologically couple with Israel, because Israel is the solution nation, as your picture says, and it's got technology that China badly wants and needs. And you talk about the numbers of people and the economy being exaggerated in China. I think China's technological prowess is exaggerated. And I say that because they couldn't even make a ballpoint pen until about, 6 or 7 years ago. Their transmissions are bad. They're good at taking. I used to, pre-COVID, I would give a speech on protecting your IP from China, and I would talk about how, and I don't have it in front of me, one year, the head of some ministry that had to deal with IP flat out said, we're not good at innovating. We're not good with technology. We need to steal it. And then the world got mad at that. So they said that's not their policy. And I would always say, well, it's officially not their policy, but do you really think it's changed? And so that's really where we are. And I think Israel's savvy enough to realize all this.
Okay, great. So I think we can conclude the program here. I'd like to thank Dan Harris from Harris Bricken for spending so much time with us and sharing so much of his knowledge and experience on China with us. It was an extremely informative session. We all will benefit from your wisdom.
Thank you. Wait. Do you want me to say much for that?
I'm sorry. Okay, here we go.
Thank you so much for that. I'm not saying this to shine you on, but you asked unbelievably good questions, every single one of them. And a lot of times on podcasts, I feel like I'm inarticulate. And I felt very articulate today, which is rare. And I think it's because they were such good questions. I could have answered any of them by speaking for 10 minutes. There was plenty to say in response to all of them. And I also liked the fact that they were not easy questions. They were not questions where I would say they were obvious questions. So I would just say, yes, that's correct. And then have to think like, what do I say that it doesn't sound simplistic? So no, I really, you prepared. It's like when I'm interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, I see the article, my quote always sounds fantastic because they pulled a quote that fits, et cetera, et cetera. If I'm interviewed by the Missouri Herald, a lot of times they get what I said wrong. And I kind of sound like an idiot.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much for those kind words. I really appreciate it.